Okay. Yeah, it is a bit of a wow, isn't it, that you say at the end of that. I'm not sure how this story was taught to you, where you encountered it, or even if you have never encountered it before and it's utterly novel. But the imagery and the message that we're told it conveys is, I think, utterly familiar to us. This is the story of idolatry, of false worship. Ralph Waldo Emerson writes that all humans worship. He says a person will worship something, have no doubt about that. We may think our tribute is paid in secret in the dark recesses of our hearts, but it will out. That which dominates our imaginations and our thoughts will determine our lives and our character. Therefore, it behooves us to be careful what we worship, for what we are worshipping, we are becoming. The story of the golden calf is part of our cultural imagination. We use the golden calf as a potent metaphor of idolatry, especially the craven and greedy kind of idolatry that values wealth above following God. And it is an especially vivid image, in part because it's a golden one. The Israelites in the story take the thing that is most valuable in their community and they make it a god. Even better that it's a calf or a bull, an image of vitality, power, even virility. Walter Brueggemann points out that it's not for nothing that the image of a gold bull is the defining icon of Wall Street, the great venue of self-sufficient wealth, power, and control. I am very taken by a golden calf sermon that just describes our culture's greed as an idol. And I don't think that this is a wrong way to read the story. I lecture at university, and so I joked with Radhika that I could easily preach about how AI is our culture's golden calf. We have traded our precious human knowledge and creativity and made a tool that we now worship, the use of which lines the pockets of billionaire technocrats and degrades our humanness and our environment. But that is not the sermon I'll give today. But I'm happy to talk about it. I think that the story of the golden calf, yes, shows us things that we would trade for God's glory, and that those things debase us. If, like me, you heard the story preached and taught to you as a child, you might anticipate a familiar question, something like, I almost want to do this in sort of a Southern American accent, but I won't, but like, what are the idols in your life? Or what is keeping you from trusting God? What trinkets or small pleasures are you choosing over a life of service to God? And I don't think they're terrible questions, but they elide what for me is the more understandable failure of the Israelites in the story, namely their impatience and their difficulty in trusting God when God is absent. Questions like, what is keeping you from trusting God, imply that trusting God is somehow easy or inevitable given the right conditions. I was told that God's presence can be felt and known just by silencing my worries and stilling my breath and coming to the altar. But the story of the golden calf is a reminder that we very often overstate the feeling of God's presence in our lives. I think often, maybe always, God's presence seems to leave us, and it is hard to remember promises, to behave like people in a covenantal relationship, and hard to avoid focusing on other precious things and even start to worship them, by which I mean to shape our lives around them. It's easy for me in such times to fill my heart and imagination with other, often noble pursuits, to make a god of a cause or a career or of relationship. I think a better question might be, how do we live when God seems absent? In her book, A Writer's Life, Annie Dillard wrote a line that haunts me, and I hate it. It's one of those things that you read and you hate, but you love. She says, how we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. For many of us, and I suspect even the saints, most days, most hours are just fraught with God's seeming absence. What are the quiet, simple, gentle, true, even banal rituals and activities of faith that demonstrate our fidelity to God, that reveal our commitment to the God of the underdog, the vulnerable, the poor, the forgotten, the discounted, the hurt, the broken? How do we live the quiet days so that our lives reflect the beauty of the God of love and life? I think it is a deeply human experience to experience God's absence, to feel severed from the divine, and to lose sight of God in the world. I would hazard to say that it is a much more common experience than the reverse, the clear-sighted, utterly confident, unquestioned, and luminous encounter with a holy God. In the Exodus narrative, the Israelites, before this moment, had experienced what is called the theophany, which was thunder, lightning, billows of smoke. They heard the Ten Commandments spoken. They witnessed Moses established as a prophet. They got all the ceremony, the long and specific lists of law, the rituals of the covenant. They had just witnessed the light show on Sinai. And then, caught in the mire of an unreasonable delay, they made an idol. They don't forget God exactly. They just break the relationship by doing things, maybe doing the very thing that God said not to do. And they did it just because that day or that hour, God seemed to have abandoned them. Moses was long delayed, and those promises seemed like a distant echo. The promise of God's partnership with Israel was not a promise of his predictable and unquestionable presence. God being with them was a pledge of fidelity and trust. I am with you. I will be your God. Not a guarantee that they'd never doubt, never lose sight, never yearn for an encounter that wouldn't come. I think it is impossible to fuel our faith only on holy encounters. We must learn that it is our commitment to living holy and loving lives that makes a sacrament of our days, our banal, quiet, gentle days. And that commitment makes the ordinary holy. How we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. I have a bold thing here which says murder. And so I thought, there is one more thing to note in this story. There's so many weird things, and I cut out, I'm not going to say how many words, but I cut out a lot, too much. But I kept this in because I think it's avoided by all of the commentaries that I read. After God's rage has cooled, the Levites, emboldened and commanded by Moses, kill 3,000 people. For Christian writers, this episode has sparked some astonishing justifications, really wild. Augustine reasoned that the slaughter of idol worshippers was a public and benevolent act of persecution directed by Moses in the guise of a secular magistrate, which is just like shoring up Augustine's own role. Aquinas saw the murder as an act of God, and the Levites were merely God's agents. Calvin, he saw it as an example of zealous activity by a band of saints, voluntary instruments of a divine will. Each of these writers has a different justification, an utterly different one. It's informed by their political and historical moment where such thinkers were obliged to interpret rather than dismiss the law. I think the worst of these was Machiavelli, whose name we use now to describe certain deplorable acts. Machiavelli, the Italian diplomat, whose book The Prince offers advice for political flourishing through deception, treachery, and crime, used the golden calf episode as good political advice. He noted that the statesman who oversees a religious community needs to have recourse to extra-legal violence, where sections of the public are not just your political enemies, but they're seen as literal heretics who must be massacred if we are to restore order and belief. Such shocking and unsettling responses reminds us of the sordid history of biblical justifications for heinous acts. All I see in this murder is the perverse way that power, even so-called righteous or prophetic power, can so easily lead to violence. Here, I think the person and life of Christ is a necessary corrective to the dumb violence of men against their enemies. So when I was trying to finish this sermon, I turned to George MacDonald, trawling for any mention of the golden calf story. He's just a writer whom I trust to say something unexpected. The only clear reference was in a sermon titled The Beginning of Miracles, which was actually about Christ's first reported miracle, turning water into wine. MacDonald sees that story as one of power, but power that's tied to love. He says this amazing thing. He says, had they not needed the wine, not for the sake of whatever show of his power would he have made it. The concurrence of man's need and his love made it possible for that glory to shine through. I love that. MacDonald is saying that the glory of God, what draws us into worship, is not raw, unbridled power. The glory of God is not that startling moment. It's not the light show on Sinai. It's not the unquestionable and certain revelation before our eyes. If we worship power alone, MacDonald says that we end up enslaved to what we idolize. I don't need to say it out loud or explicitly, but we know contemporary examples of people worshipping power, of electing officials that do not love the people who elect them, but who radiate the raw promise of power, the power of capital, the power of control, the power of self-determination, the power of violence, the power of being right. For the Israelites in this story, it's the power of the thunder and the lightning and the booming voice lead them ultimately to worship a golden calf. But Moses, as MacDonald writes, went into the thick darkness to find his God. I find this a brilliant insight into my own worship, into our expectations of what God's presence looks like, and our own tendency to lose patience and hope. God's power, as seen in Christ, is power wrapped in love. It's the power to liberate, to heal, to endure, maybe to break alongside, or to bear up in anguish. It's power to celebrate and to hope and to fight for change. That is the power that calls us to worship. But that power in practice, it looks really modest. It doesn't look powerful. It is a daily or even hourly act, and it's mostly invisible to others. It plays out, I think, in gentle moments with our children, in fraught interactions with strangers, in the words that we use and the choices we make, and how we choose to relinquish coercive power for gracious and humble acts of love. So I think that the story of the golden calf shows us that the revelation of God, the promise of hope, is evident not only, or rarely, or barely in those burning mountaintop moments of clarity and grace that we see only fleetingly, but instead in the powerful daily acts of loving kindness that testify to the presence of God in our lives. How we spend our time today, here, how we listen and share life and offer peace to one another, that is a vision of how we can, with God's grace, spend our lives. Amen.